Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us here today. We're opening the 56th meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, and this will be the first public session of a new study that we're undertaking on public-private partnerships. We believe there's a great deal of interest on the part of the general public and certainly of members present to measure and examine the efficacy and of the public-private partnership programs that the governments are engaged in. So we're very pleased to welcome four knowledgeable witnesses to make representations today from the C.D. Howe Institute, Mr. Finn Poschmann. From the Conference Board of Canada, Mr. V.J. Gill, Associate Director of Public Policy. Welcome, Mr. Gill. From the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, Hugh Mackenzie, Research Associate. Welcome, Mr. Mackenzie. And the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, Mr. Mark Romoff, the President and CEO, and Mr. Michael Marasco, the member of the Board of the Administration. Mr. Finn Poschmann was to be the first presenter. I think we're going to change the order up briefly and ask Mr. V.J. Gill if he will present first. Normally, gentlemen, we ask people to limit their presentations to 5 to 10 minutes because there's four of you. We want to have adequate time for the committee members to put their questions. So, Mr. Gill, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Sure. I'd like to thank you for having me today. So I'm from the Conference Board of Canada. We're a not-for-profit research think tank. We've published research on this very topic in the past and continue to be interested in the topic because we think it's an important infrastructure delivery, and obviously infrastructure services have important implications for the competitiveness of the country. So in terms of the mechanisms, the key mechanisms and the drivers of efficiencies for PPPs relative to traditional procurement, I think a couple things to flag. One is that there's been kind of an ongoing debate, or maybe not even the debate hasn't actually been had, but it's not even always clear what is and what is not a P3. And within the space, I think the C2P3 has done this pretty well in terms of defining within the space of P3s. There's a whole degree of different types of projects and different levels of risk transfer and different types of bundling of operating and maintaining phases. So I think any times we're going to be involved in a discussion of what is and what is optimal, we have to consider what is the specific structure of the P3 that we're talking about. There is also, and we just briefly discussed this, this issue of private financing. Obviously, is going to come up. You probably heard about it already. I think this is also an ongoing debate in terms of how strong a mechanism private financing is in terms of providing some discipline to the project and how necessary it is for the P3 structure to succeed. And I think you're going to see that there's obviously there's a debate raging about that now as well. But just to back up a little bit, I think in general, when we talk about infrastructure, when the public thinks about infrastructure, we often think about public infrastructure to begin with. But it's important to note, if we look at total investment in fixed assets, the public sector portion is a small minority. Gross fixed capital formation in the country, public sector speaking, is 16% on an annual basis approximately in Canada. And even if we limit that infrastructure investment on the private side to non-residential fixed structures, over twice the private sector investment in this is over twice of what the public sector investment is. So I think it's important to keep in mind when we're looking at the maintenance record of public infrastructure that, I think there is something to be learned from the large investments that are ongoing in the private sector in terms of, and thinking about how we could capture some of those efficiencies. How we actually do it is one thing or another, but that's, I think it's one point that's often lost. And just kind of one point in terms of the breadth of P3s in Canada. We've heard a lot about them over the last, obviously, 10 or 15 years, and there's been a large shift in terms of P3 delivery in Canada. But just to give a rough idea of how large it is in terms of total government expenditures on capital, if we look at P3 transactions as a percentage of government spending on infrastructure or gross fixed capital formation, we're roughly looking at about 12 to 14% a year. So this isn't a 75 or 80% thing. You could take that information however you want, but I mean, it's give you a rough idea of what the scope is. And in terms of internationally where we are, this places us, in the top handful of countries, but even the trailblazers like UK and Australia, they're 15 or 18%. They're not at that 70 or 80% level, and they never will be, primarily because we have obviously a large number of small projects that aggregate up to be a large portion of the whole. So I'll stop there for now, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Gill. Mr. Finn Poshman has now arrived, the Vice President of Research of the C.D. Howe Institute. Mr. Poshman, if you're ready, we invited witnesses to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, giving your views on public-private partnerships. Welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you for your welcome. Very glad to be here, and my apologies for being late. With that, I'll not apologize for the infrastructure between here and the airport. It's getting better all the time, I'm sure. So good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks very much for inviting me to appear before you today. It's an absolute delight to speak on this important topic. I'll not refer to numbers, but rather some first principles in how we or I think about public-private partnerships. So first, by way of introduction, and for those of you who don't know me, I run the research and publications branch or division of the C.D. Howe Institute. It means I manage the research agenda. So we are a public policy think tank, a charity with an educational mandate. And I'm here because of my interest in the topic, and I've written a number of articles and chapters in the field. So, as we know, governments and their political leaders like public-private partnerships, or P3s, for a number of reasons. First, P3s bring private sector capital, money to the table. And even for governments, money can sometimes be in short supply. Second, what comes attached to the money, assuming a well-written P3 contract, is an important element of risk sharing. Private partners to a P3 are expected to absorb a significant share of project completion and operational risk, the risk of failure. And because their own money is at stake, the private partner normally has or should have appropriate incentives to manage the risk well. Third, P3s are more likely, as compared with traditional procurement, to be completed on time and on budget, and that tends to make political leaders pretty happy. So those are some high-level reasons to be interested in P3s. But it's important to look at some of the specifics of the contracting process and the risk-sharing embodied therein. So P3s are most commonly used for large infrastructure projects, highways, bridges, hospitals, schools, whatever. That's because those projects soak up capital, they tend to be long-lived, and they embody risks of the sort that do not arise when governments procure a box of pencils or some new staplers or whatever. Large infrastructure projects involve financial risks, design risks, construction or building risks, and operational risks, among others. The idea underpinning a P3 is that the private partner undertakes some of these risks in return for an appropriate financial reward. It takes a good P3 contract to specify the division of risks and rewards. Contracts are necessarily imperfect and incomplete because they are human constructs. Contracts are entered into under conditions of risk and uncertainty, imperfect and asymmetric information, and potentially moral hazard. That is what makes contracting and getting it right, as best as we can, very important to the P3 process. P3s have their limits, and we should be clear about those. I like to express it by using the old aerospace saying, faster, better, cheaper. Choose any two. So let's say a provincial or federal government wants to get an overpass built and puts out an ordinary tender that generally describes the overpass and awards the construction contract to the lowest bidder. The bridge will probably get built, and built cheaply, but it might not be built on time, and it might not be built terribly well. It might get done late, and bits of concrete might start falling down after a few years and hitting cars below. So that's a bad outcome. So suppose instead we write a contract that lays off some completion risk to the winning bidder. So you have financial rewards for finishing early, financial penalties for finishing late. This is fairly standard procurement contracting in infrastructure. But now you're embodying within the contract some of the completion risk. The overpass will still get built, likely on time, and it'll be built at relatively low cost. You still don't know when or if chunks of concrete are going to come falling off. So it might be faster and cheaper, but not better. Now consider a more complete contract that embodies more risk sharing. The private partner agrees to take on operational risk. Say the overpass will maintain the capacity to move a certain number of vehicles per day for the next 20 years and to transfer ownership of the overpass to the government in good condition after that time. In this last circumstance, the government is likely to produce an overpass that is delivered faster and works better than in the case of ordinary procurement. Faster and better, but not necessarily cheaper, because the financing partner, the private partner, has taken on the completion risk, operational risk, and long-term financial risk. These are good risks for governments to lay off by way of contracting, but it takes money to manage those risks, and there's no guarantee that in that circumstance the project will be delivered cheaper, at least in the short or medium terms. There's another risk, too, that government cannot easily lay off. The long-term financial risk the private partner takes on exposes it to the risk of bankruptcy. The project may fail, and project proponents will lose their investment, but much of the cost of that failure will inevitably redound to government. So, key messages. P3s can do things faster. They can do things better, and they can do things cheaper than in the case of ordinary procurement. But they cannot likely achieve all of those three goals. Governments can and should write good contracts that lay off risks in exchange for suitable rewards, but they cannot expect to lay off all risks. Governments should write good contracts and understand them, but they must also understand that contracts are necessarily imperfect because they are human endeavors and they cannot anticipate every circumstance. Generally, where governments can privatize, they should, because governments don't need to do everything. Where privatization is inappropriate, we should recognize that this is often the case. Governments can and should embrace P3s, but they should do so with open eyes and a firm grasp of the risks they retain. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Poshman. You made very good use of 5 minutes. Thank you for being so concise. Next, for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Hugh Mackenzie. 5 to 10 minutes, Hugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for the invitation to appear. I think, having reviewed the list of participants here, I think I'm the official skunk at this garden party. So I'm going to try and play that role as best I can. Let me start with a sort of a general proposition right off the top that, first of all, just a clarification of terms. We use the term public-private partnerships, which I think in itself is a little bit misleading, because a partnership implies a confluence of interest between the parties. In fact, if you look at even the most sophisticated of the kinds of contracts that Finn's been talking about, there are two parties to these contracts, often multiple parties to these contracts, each of which have different interests. So I think it's probably more accurate to call these things agreements rather than partnerships. I think that helps to center it in a more kind of neutral environment. Partnership implies something that doesn't really reflect the underlying business reality that's in operation here. The second point I'd make is that I suspect people might be expecting me to spend most of my time talking about how much more noble it is to be doing everything in the public sector than in the private sector. That's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is the economics. And for me, the fundamental issue and the fundamental challenge that P3s have to meet comes to bear when you introduce the concept of private financing of public projects. The reason why I say that is because I think that these agreements work best when they take full advantage of the strengths of both parties to the agreement. So let's think about what are the strengths that government brings to these kinds of arrangements. One is that governments, and probably the most important, is that governments can borrow money more cheaply than anybody else can in our society. And if we this is not a philosophical proposition. This is an observation of market outcomes. If you look at the rates of interest that are paid on public borrowing as opposed to private borrowing, you see significant differences in the interest costs. Those differences, even a difference of 1 or 2%, can make a significant difference in the lifetime financing cost of a project. As a kind of rough example, a 20-year project with a 1% difference in financing costs, which would be low for the difference between triple Ps and public, has an effect of about 15 percentage points on the lifetime financing cost of the project. So relatively small-sounding differences in borrowing cost can make a big difference. The second thing that the second advantage that the public sector has in borrowing is that for some of the same reasons why for some of the same reasons that are implied by Finn's comment about contracts, the transactions costs associated with public borrowing are substantially lower than the transactions costs associated with borrowing through triple Ps. My experience from looking at these things, and granted there's very little really useful information out there about the actual finances of public-private partnerships, but my sense is that the general rule of thumb is that somewhere between 3 and 4% of the total project cost per party is about what you pay to put the paper and the agreements and do the due diligence, put all that together. So that's kind of a deadweight cost. So just going into the gate, you've got pretty significant cost disadvantages on the financing side that a triple P project that includes financing will bear. The other big issue, another strength that governments have, is that because governments represent the entire population and are responsible one way or the other for all of the infrastructure projects that are taking place in the public sector, they have a much broader base over which to pool risk than any private operator is going to have. And basic insurance principles tell you that the broader the universe over which you can spread the risk, the more diverse the universe over which you can spread the risk, the lower the cost is going to be of bearing that risk. So that risk is going to be more expensive for private operators to bear than the public. And the third thing that governments do, and this is not a trivial point, is that governments are in principle best equipped to reflect the public interest, and that translates in concrete terms to everything from the amount of information that's disclosed about how P3 projects actually work, right through to the other end of the telescope, in which it becomes, for particular kinds of P3 projects, it becomes much more difficult for governments to enact changes in public policy because agreements lock them into a certain way of doing things and a certain provision of a service. Some of the obvious complexities that you run into there is, for example, when you do a P3 for a garbage contract, and then you try to implement a waste reduction program, and you find yourself committed to pay for a certain volume of garbage whether you're actually generating it or not. My basic point, and I'm going to conclude with this, is that there are a lot of strengths that go with the implementation of infrastructure financing through P3s. But they have a lot more to do with forcing the public sector to be better project managers and a lot less to do with the particular form in which that's delivered. And I think about, for example, the province that I'm most familiar with is in Ontario. Infrastructure Ontario does a fabulous job of project management. It does a much better job of managing a project for a hospital in Timmins or North Bay than the North Bay Hospital Board is going to be able to do, or the Timmins Hospital Board is going to be able to do, because Infrastructure Ontario is involved in literally dozens of projects. They get really good at it. And one of the things that people that are involved in delivering major projects in pretty much any organization will tell you is that project management is critical to getting what you want and when you want. My basic point is that I think it is possible to get those advantages, including things like, including many of the things that Finn's been talking about, without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, we can negotiate better agreements, more comprehensive agreements with the private sector without giving away the store in terms of the huge differentials in financing costs. And the last thing I would say in conclusion is that on the risk issue, there's actually a fair amount that's been written. I think committee members will probably have seen the article that appeared in the Globe ROB yesterday, making reference to a study out of UBC that goes into risk issues in a fairly significant way. Another study done by that well-known socialist body, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Britain, has looked in detail at the issue of risk transfer in P3 projects in hospitals and roads in Britain. And what they find is that in general in these contracts, that there's a lot less risk transfer taking place on a day-to-day basis than actually appears on the surface. And what is probably more important is that the nature of the beast is that it creates a risk because the project is in the hands of a private operator that can fail, that didn't exist before. And we see many examples of that in Canada. And Finn talks about incentives, and I'll conclude here. Because the government has an overriding commitment to provide the service, the government will ultimately always have to pick up the pieces if the project fails. And so what that means is that there's a strong incentive on P3 proponents to telescope the risk that they bear and load it onto the back end. In other words, to underprice the risk during the life of the contract, knowing that if they get caught in their underpricing, they have the ability to walk away. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McKenzie. Finally, the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, Mr. Mark Romoff and Michael Marasco. 5 to 10 minutes, gentlemen.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure for me, of course, to be here this morning to appear before this committee and on behalf of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, and to speak a little bit about three things. I want to talk about the P3 market in Canada. I'd like to talk about the role of the Council and the opportunity to take Canada's growing P3 experience and expertise global. And as you've mentioned, Mr. Chair, Michael Marasco is here with me. Michael is a director of the Council and the CEO of Plenary Investments, and he'll have a moment. He'll have a few minutes to speak in just a moment. As you all know, today all countries of the world are facing large infrastructure deficits at a time when they're also confronting financial constraints. This is true, of course, in Canada as well. But at the same time, sound and modern infrastructure is key to Canada's productivity and economic growth, and ultimately to a prosperous and globally competitive Canada. With regard to public-private partnerships, or P3s in particular, these are not new to Canada. Over the past 20 years, there have been more than $58 billion invested in more than 180 projects across Canada and across a wide variety of sectors, notably in the area of transportation and health. I've put up a couple of slides behind you, which will give you a look at that. And you'll see the sectors that are identified there that have been active as P3s, and as I mentioned earlier, principally in the transportation area and in the health sector. And these projects are taking place right across Canada, although you can see that a great proportion of them are in Ontario, and after that, British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And of the 180 projects, more than half are now operational, with the remainder either under construction or in procurement. Over this time, over this period of 20 years, Canada has become a global leader in P3s, attracting P3 developers and partners from around the world to invest in Canadian infrastructure. So if you have a look at the landscape in Canada, you'll see a large number of companies from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from the US, from Spain, from France, from Japan, all attracted to the Canadian marketplace because of the nature of the Canadian infrastructure pipeline and the model that has been adopted in Canada. And over this period, we have developed a model which has incorporated best practices and lessons learned from around the world. And today, the Canadian P3 model is recognized internationally as best in class. Quite remarkable, given that this is an approach to infrastructure development that began in the UK and in Australia, and today both those countries are coming to study the Canadian approach to learn how they might improve their own approach to P3s. The Canadian Council itself was formed in 1993 at the same time that the concept of P3s was being explored as an alternative to traditional procurement for infrastructure development. And we will be celebrating our 20th anniversary at our annual conference this year in November in Toronto. Our conference, too, is recognized internationally as the premier gathering of the P3 community with over 1,200 leaders from both the public sector and private sector, combining all the talent brought to bear on the P3 market, all brought together, as I say, in Toronto in November, from across Canada and internationally. With respect to the Council itself, we are a not-for-profit, non-partisan, member-based organization with now 450 organizations making up the Council, and that includes broad representation from the public sector, governments at the federal level, provincial, municipal level, right across Canada. About 20% of our membership is coming from the public sector, with the remaining 80% reflecting the cross-section of players in the construction sector, consulting engineers, the financial community, the lawyers, architects, the full range of players in typical P3 projects. The Council conducts research, provides education, hosts events around the country, and also delivers on its mandate by promoting the successes that have been achieved by Canada in the P3 space. When I talk about research, some of the examples that we have undertaken over the past year, I've brought them with me and I will leave them for the committee. As an example, this is a P3 guide for municipalities. You may be aware that municipalities across Canada are becoming increasingly interested in P3s, and so we've produced that document. 1,200 copies have been distributed across Canada. We also produced a report in the last year on Canada's activity in the health sector, particularly hospitals. There have been 50 hospitals built in Canada since 2004 using the public-private partnerships model for a value of some $18 billion. And we also undertake an annual survey of the general public to test their perceptions of P3s. And the last survey conducted last November had a result of 70% of those surveyed indicating support for the public-private partnerships approach to infrastructure development. Let me finish off, Mr. Chair, by saying that in our view, P3s are an effective vehicle for renewing and growing infrastructure and for delivering strong value for money for Canadian taxpayers. And I think you'll appreciate Mike Marasco's comments now, because he will bring a private sector perspective to this important area. Thank you again for your time and attention.
Well, thank you, Mr. Romoff. Mr. Marasco, you have about 4 to 5 minutes remaining, if you like.
Yeah, thank you. Well, unlike my colleagues that have spoken before me, I'm not a researcher. I'm a practitioner. I spent 26 years of my life in the public sector, involved in real estate and large capital projects. And I left 5.5 years ago to become CEO of Plenary Concessions with the Plenary Group. And I now know why we couldn't possibly replicate what the private sector does when I was a loyal public servant. And what I want to share with you as a starting point is my tale of two projects. I was with the province of BC at the time when these projects were done on the public sector side and had an in-depth knowledge of them. And then subsequent to joining Plenary, I learned why and what the outcomes were and how they occurred. And I think it's a practical demonstration. And I think, you know, research is great, and a lot of it's done in theory and on spreadsheets. But the practical examples are the one I want to draw your attention to. So these two projects were done in the same market at the same time in the greater Vancouver area. And one was done using P3 procurement, a design, build, finance, maintain model. And the other one was done using traditional construction management. The interesting part about these projects, the Vancouver Trade and Convention Centre, which was done using traditional construction management, the government set up a very, very robust governance structure because they didn't want another failure, another embarrassment. And they set up a separate corporation, appointed a board. Some of the best project managers in Canada were assigned to the project. And it started in 2004 at the same time that the Abbotsford Hospital was started. The Abbotsford Hospital was done as a design, build, finance, maintain project. And it finished on time and under budget. And the Vancouver Trade and Convention Centre was 6 months late and 55% over budget, despite all of the efforts for government. And I know a lot of the people that were on the Convention Centre project, some of Canada's best talent. Interestingly enough, and this is where the irony is that both of them had the same architect. Both projects had the same construction company. And so you have to ask yourself, how could that be? Same market, same construction company, same architect. And the reality of it is having been brought in to look at those projects and try and help government resolve the issues, I have a good understanding why. Is you can't replicate the alignment of interests that we bring to bear and the pressure that we bring on project partners to perform in the public sector. It just can't be done. A lot of it's about risk transfer, clearly, and we've heard my colleagues talk about that, but I want to take you on a little journey that's going to it's going to open your eyes to something that hasn't been talked about, and that's with respect to the value for money. It goes well beyond risk transfer, and I would also argue that public-private partnerships are not about finance. Finance is the catalyst for the risk transfer as well as what I'm about to share with you. In the value proposition that any agency goes through, and this speaks to the point about strong project management offices, if you have them in place, you can actually you can actually balance these four bubbles: the capital expenditures, the maintenance and repair costs, the life cycle refurbishment, and the utilities costs. And I sat on many project committees in my 26 years where we had the operators, we had all the partners at the table with the objective of trying to optimize the whole of life costs. And then what happened is we get the capital costs estimates, and we summarily dismissed the people that were there from the operations side saying, thank you, but we can't afford to spend that extra $20 million to achieve $100 million cost savings over the 30 years because we're constrained by our capital cost inputs. And so consequently, we'd go on and we drive a project solution that actually was it was more detrimental to taxpayers. The objective and the value proposition around PPPs is to make that box smaller. And this is the thinking about it. I draw your attention to the chart. If you look at the facility costs of operations over a 40-year period, 8.7% of those costs relate to the cost of first-in construction costs. 29% relate to life cycle refurbishment, and 58% to the ongoing operations and maintenance. And I'd ask even the government of Canada where they make all of their decisions around capital budgeting. I'm sure they don't approve the 29% for life cycle refurbishment at the time that they approve a capital project, nor do they approve. In some cases, they may approve a one-year operating budget, but no one's looking at it as a whole. The whole focus and the drive behind a DBFM is to optimize the size of this entire circle, not 8.7% of the total whole of life cost of that asset. And so consequently what happens is typically as a public servant, we were always driven to dealing with deferred maintenance and all the aspects that run down Canada's infrastructure much quicker. Under the DBFM approach, the objective is to make the balls in the box smaller. And as you can see by this example, the capital expenditures were more up front, but it reduced the ongoing maintenance and operations costs. And the beauty of this is that the outcomes are guaranteed by the private partner because it's a performance-based contract. It isn't an exercise of theory of well-meaning people sitting around the table thinking about how to save money. We actually guarantee it. And the financing returns are the vehicle that enforce that guarantee. You know, we talk about savings. Yeah, I'm just wrapping up right now. These are examples of the P3 projects across Canada, and I'll encourage you to look at the charts when you get them afterwards, but these are all from value for money reports, some of which have been reviewed by the Auditors General, of the savings that have occurred in these projects. And when you look at it on a percentage basis, you can see that the average savings are just under 20%. I will conclude by saying the government borrowed for the Vancouver Trade and Convention Centre at 75 basis points over long-term Canada's at the time. The Abbotsford Hospital was cost the borrowing was somewhere in the neighborhood of 195 basis points over long-term Canada's. So the difference is something like 1.2% increase in costs. But the government had to borrow $365 million more on the Vancouver Trade and Convention Centre, and because of the focus on first costs, the price is yet unknown for the long-term whole-of-life costs and refurbishment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Marasco. I know the committee members have many questions, so we'll jump right into it. First, for the New Democratic Party, Linda Duncan. 5 minutes, please, Linda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hard to do 5 minutes on such a large panel. I'll do my best. In a number of the papers, in particular the C.D. Howe one, which I skimmed and hope to read in greater depth, but thank you all for all the materials. The point is made that left-wing leaning thinkers are against P3s for ideological reasons. I guess what I would throw out to you then isn't equally the other way around, that those who are pro-P3 tend to lean towards, well, private is always better. We've heard a number of examples given here about successes, for example, the case studies shown here, but we need only look through the various articles written in studies where there are lots of examples of where, in fact, the P3 cost a lot more, and in fact, in the end, a lot of the costs were downsized. To give another example, British Columbia West Coast Highways, taxpayers having to pay $200 million more out of their pocket than was estimated. We heard from the agency and the government now, the P3 office that is managing these, and raised the point with us that part of the problem has been there was varied expertise and ability and capacity across federal agencies and departments to actually manage these projects, which in many cases got them in trouble with trying to manage or even to write these contracts. So in theory, the P3 office is now assisting with that. I guess the question that I would throw out to each of you is, you all seem to be raising the issue of when you use P3s, the projects are much better managed. But isn't it equally possible that if instead of having a P3 office, we had an office that did the P3 work but also helped departments and agencies to better manage these projects and to determine how better to proceed with the project and cost? So essentially my point is I'm still not convinced that the P3 is the only way to go. I guess my question is, are there circumstances where government could also manage projects better and not just going by P3?
Are you directing your question to any one of the witnesses or generally?
Whoever would like to answer it.
Anyone would like to respond? Mr. Want to go first? Mr. Marasco, a brief answer, please.
Yes, yeah, brief answer. I think the best example was what we tried to do in British Columbia is we tried to create that project office of excellence in the Vancouver Trade and Convention Centre case. We had the best project managers in the country. We had a great governance model. And despite that, the inability to make timely decisions as a result of all of the concerns that political, public transparency, I guess fear to make timely decisions is what caused that project to end up where it did. And I think you couldn't ask for a better model in terms of governance and competency with respect to project managers. So that would be my example.
Hugh, did you have your hand up? Respond to Linda.
I will. I think as a general proposition, I would say that. Speaking to government, that if you can't manage a project yourself, you're probably not going to be successful at managing a P3 arrangement either. The one point that was made that I think is really important is that there are a number of the arguments that are advanced for P3s that identify really dumb ways that governments go about running long-term infrastructure projects. And I guess maybe I'll be generous and say that it's an open question as to whether government's capable of doing a better job of this or not. But as an example, managing over a life cycle, making provisions for life cycle maintenance of a project that you build. Those are the kinds of things that anybody who, any homeowner, anybody who has responsibility for an asset kind of thinks automatically you do. Governments have a tendency to panic cyclically when it comes to their budgets, and the first thing to go when the economy turns down, the first thing to go is infrastructure spending, and the second thing to go is maintenance, and it's simply a matter of pushing those costs out into the future. And so, I mean, I guess I'm enough of an optimist about the ability of the public sector to fix itself to say that I don't think we should necessarily be prepared to pay the kind of financial penalty that we end up paying simply because, as a public sector, we're not able to manage these large infrastructure assets sensibly.
Time, but Mr. Romoff wanted a brief comment, and then I will give you a chance to do a supplementary if you need it.
I just wanted to add that while the role of the Council is to promote greater uptake of public-private partnerships, innovative approaches to infrastructure development and service delivery through public-private partnerships with all levels of government, the reality is that P3s is not the be-all and end-all, and it is not the right approach in every instance. It is certainly a very valuable tool, an arrow in the quiver, if you like, of approaches to infrastructure development. But value for money is a real key factor in deciding whether you go down the P3 road or traditional procurement. What I would add, too, is that if we could bring the same discipline and oversight to traditional procured projects as is brought to P3s, I think you would find that those traditionally procured projects would also be far better delivered and with far better outcomes.
Okay, I just have a quick follow-up question from what Mr. Romoff said. And it occurred to me in sitting here and listening to the presenters, it appears that there are now actually, we could call them lobbyists for P3s. So obviously, this is an area of business where businessmen think they can make money. But there's probably some projects that are ideally suited for that. In other words, certain corporate entities would like to get into some, big projects. But a lot of the infrastructure deficit in this country right now is the crumbling roads and sidewalks. So I'm wondering if you could say, are there some areas where P3 works and others not, and therefore the government should also be paying attention to how we can more effectively deliver the rest of infrastructure?
Anyone? Actually, Finn, would you like to participate?
Thank you. It's a very good question, Mr. Chairman, Madam. P3s are probably unnecessary in a range of circumstances. Let's divide up projects into ones where you have a really good idea of how to specify how to do the thing. For instance, I know how to make coffee cups, right? I know how to make coffee cups at industrial scale. It's really easy to specify. There aren't a lot of ways to go wrong once you have the general idea. The transaction costs associated with negotiating a contract and risk sharing in the production process, they're not really worth it. You can just specify, you know, you want some coffee cups and I'll deliver them. So not a good P3. But let's suppose you want to build a fairly complex system like a hospital, and you don't know the right, as a contractor or as a public partner, you don't know the right mix of capital that should go in up front, how much you're going to have to set aside for operating costs down the road, what bits of machinery or operational repair, CapEx costs you're going to bear down the road. You don't know all of that stuff, and you don't have to. What you do know is you want a running piece of a running building, a running hospital system for X number of years, and you can leave that to your private partner to deliver on and to take on the risks of delivering. So when you don't know a lot about how to get there, but you know what you want, then you write the contract that specifies the outcome and let the partner manage the risks to get there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poshman. We're well over time. I'll be generous with all of the parties. I think if we're more like 7 minutes or so, Jacques, if you would like, Mr. Jacques Gourde for the Conservatives.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for coming this morning. I have questions about P3s. I think there are advantages, and the witnesses have been saying that it's in terms of the design and management, and witnesses have also said there's expertise already in Canada, and there has been for about 20 years. I have a question about the expertise in the long-term management after the design for the maintenance of the infrastructure. Year over year, new infrastructure is added with P3s. Do we have the necessary human resources to add more infrastructure with long-term maintenance? Because over the first 20 years, we've had expertise that's been developed in the human area for management, for long-term maintenance. But if we keep adding new infrastructure projects, and there will be more in the future, we know we can develop that expertise, but do we have the capacity, the human capacity to do so? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
First of all, developing that expertise, there is a tremendous talent pool in Canada of people who have that long-term expertise. I think the challenge that we often face in the public sector is this budget balancing exercise that Hugh referred to, and is that what happens is when you get into tight budget circumstances, what happens is the first thing that gets cut is maintenance. And once you get into that deferred maintenance cycle, it ends up costing taxpayers so much more money. In our case, we've got examples of projects where we've taken people out of the public sector. They come to work for us to provide maintenance on the private sector side, and you say, boy, it must be tough doing your job because you're subject to abatement if you fail. And they say, actually, you know what? This is the easiest job I've ever had because I have the resources available to me to do my maintenance on time and to ensure that that facility is going to operate at optimum performance. We've been in business in Canada and Australia, and we don't have any problem bringing those resources to bear to serve and develop and maintain these assets for the long term.
Just one quick comment. I think that I would agree, but maybe cast it slightly differently. The issue that we confront in long-term planning for infrastructure in Canada is not an issue related to the availability of financing. It's not an issue related to the availability of people. It's an organizational issue. It's a mindset issue. You can't, the inevitable consequence of making your maintenance expenditures subject to the budgetary cycle to the extremes that we have in this country at all three levels of government is that you end up with maintenance backlogs that gradually evolve into infrastructure availability crises. And we can see that. I mean, there are examples of that all over the country. But I guess the issue is, for me, is what's the answer? We've identified a problem with the way the public sector operates. One answer is to give up on it and to pay an enormous price in terms of additional financing costs in order to get around that problem. And the other is to look more carefully at the way we actually do these things in the public sector. And I guess I'm an optimist that second approach can address the fundamental structural problems in the way we've traditionally managed infrastructure in Canada, while at the same time avoiding paying these enormous penalties up front that we end up paying. One of the observations that I'd make about P3s that I think is an unfortunate consequence. It's not anything I think that anybody who's promoting P3s is necessarily underlining, but it tends to reinforce this sense of unreality in people that somehow we can get something for free. You know, that if we have a project done through a P3, we're not paying for it. Somebody else is paying for it. And I think I'll quote my sometimes acquaintance or paraphrase my sometimes acquaintance John Tory, who some of you may know, who made the observation specifically with respect to public transit funding in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, that politicians at all three levels of government when it comes to transit in Canada have been in a state of denial. They've been trying to pretend that there's some way of getting this stuff built without anybody paying for it. And on that issue, I'm actually pretty small c conservative. I don't believe that you can get stuff that you don't pay for. Any 2-year-old knows that. And it's time and I actually don't think we're going to be able to succeed in coming to terms with this infrastructure funding and operation issue until we're able to confront the reality that we're going to have to ask people to pay for things.
Mr. Romoff would like an opportunity to respond briefly. Jacques, you still have 1 or 2 minutes left.
I just wanted to pick up on Hugh's point that there are some who believe that, in fact, it's good to go ahead with a P3 because they won't have to worry about the funding. But in fact, that's very much the wrong reason to go ahead with a P3, and we would never encourage that. The reality is that when you move ahead with a public-private partnership, the debt obligation is on your books right from the outset. There is no off-book accounting here for P3s in Canada. And so the reality is that if you don't think you're going to have to pay for it, that reality will come home pretty quickly when you move ahead. So all the more reason why it's critically important to understand at the outset what are the conditions around moving ahead with the P3, and that's in fact one of the reasons why we've had such tremendous uptake on the P3 guide, because it tries to address some of these issues that have been subject to interpretation, and people need to understand clearly what the rules going forward are in order that they can design and develop a truly well-architected partnership that will get the outcomes that we're talking about as the derivatives of the really successful P3 projects. Thank you.
Jacques, I'm afraid you're pretty much out of time. Thank you very much. Next for the NDP, Kennedy Stewart. Welcome to the committee, Kennedy.
Thanks very much, and thank you to the witnesses. I had the great pleasure of working in the UK for some time in units that were looking at PFI and P3s, and they have a wealth of knowledge, so I'm glad we've referred to them here today. It's really worth looking at their really mass experimentation with this model. The one thing I learned from being there, of course, is it's not just contract conditions, it's monitoring that's essential, and that's often where these projects seem to fall down. Is that the contract conditions are probably not tight enough, and the monitoring is also lax, and often companies are left to monitor themselves. But I know from my rational choice training that if monitoring costs more than doing the work yourself, then you probably shouldn't pursue these things at all. So that's just my take on it. So can I go back to your slide, Mr. Romoff, the number of projects in Canada? Is it possible to go back there? Am I going to...
My assistant here, I think that'll be possible.
So the smoke's got to roll out of the computers.
Would you have a question in the meantime?
Well, I was struck by the just how few projects you had on your slide.
180 projects.
Right. So we have federal government, and we have 10 provinces and 3 territories and 4,000 municipal governments in Canada. And we have how many projects, you said?
180 projects.
180. So for me, the beauty of federalism is that it allows us to experiment. So if we have that many governments, why do we have so few?
Because there are some governments that have been strong uptakers, if you like, of this particular model. And what we're finding now is, in fact, the marketplace is growing. So both the provinces that have not been engaged in P3 approaches are now looking very seriously at this. Saskatchewan would be the most immediate case in point that is moving ahead with a number of P3 projects. And you are also seeing a greater interest from the territories in the north. So, for instance, you might know that Nunavut, for instance, is going ahead with their airport in Iqaluit, and they've announced that as a P3 project. Again, part of the role of the Council is to heighten awareness around this approach to infrastructure development and service delivery, and to enable those who are thinking about it to develop a level of confidence and understanding. So what we've seen actually is that it's a bit of a hockey stick when you look at the sort of past 20 years. The uptake at the outset was fairly modest, but over the last 5 years, the degree of interest in P3s has shot up quite significantly.
But I'm just saying that out of 180, so we have 180 projects out of all these potential. What slice of all the projects in Canada would be P3s? Mr. Gill, Mr. Chair.
Sorry. At the outset, I kind of alluded to this, that, and Mark has said that certainly uptake has been increasing, but it's never going to be somewhere around 50 or 70 or 80% of the projects. And part of this is related to the transaction costs and the upfront costs that are not fixed as a percentage of the project. They vary a bit with the percentage of project value, but they're essentially these transaction costs that have to be eventually have to make your minimum project size, say 30 or 40 or $50 million before it's even going to be on the radar for P3s. And just by virtue of the fact that you mentioned 4,000 municipalities, many of the projects are obviously in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range. When you put them all together, municipalities spend about as much money as the provincial governments on infrastructure, but there are many smaller and few projects.
But that's precisely my question. If this is something that we should be seriously considering, why has there been so little uptake? I mean, there's political stripes of all different kinds at municipalities and provincial level. Why has there been such a low uptake?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's already been mentioned. The issue is transaction costs related to these projects. They're very complex contracts. You're right. We call them partnerships, but they're in fact legal agreements. And there's a critical size needed to make these projects viable so that the transaction costs don't overtake the value for money proposition. And generally, we're looking at projects north of $50 million. I would argue that if you probably look at these 180 projects, first of all, the majority of them have been over the last 5 years, as Mark has indicated. And secondly, I would say that the majority of them are north of $100 million. Most small municipal projects are not good candidates. And there's a lot of complex renovation projects that are not good candidates. So I think, just like as Mark said in the outset of his comments, P3 is not a panacea for all project delivery. It probably, as was the case in the UK, it only covers probably 10 or 11% of the total capital projects inventory. It's just one arrow in the quiver, and when properly applied, it produces strong value for taxpayers.
If you respond briefly to that as well, you still have 2 minutes or so.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. It's an issue of scale. There needs to be a lot of money at play in order to make people interested in doing these things. But it does trigger a thought in my mind, which is that if we take as a given that the kinds of structural issues about life cycle management and ensuring that maintenance is actually done on time and that sort of thing, if we take that as a given, as a problem with the way the public sector in Canada manages infrastructure, given the fact that P3s are never going to be more than maybe 10 or 15%, even if the fantasy world of the P3 proponents descends on us, just the way the market works means that there aren't enough projects that are big enough to be able to consume that much more. It just seems to me that there's an enormous return to the public as a whole for making the totality of the way we manage infrastructure and maintain it and operate it over a life cycle more effective, so that even if I were to concede that those projects that are of interest to P3 proponents are going to go the P3 way, that doesn't eliminate the need to address the issues that underlie the argument for P3s.
Mr. Romoff has a very brief comment, and then I'll allow you a supplementary, and we'll be done.
Just one final point. I think in the case of smaller projects, there's also the opportunity where it makes sense to bundle them together so that, in fact, you do have a large enough overall project and a critical mass to enable you to go ahead with a traditional approach to P3s. I would, though, add that, and you may have seen this in the case of the UK, that, in fact, they have had a number of very successful smaller P3s, smaller than the 50 million or 100 million that we're talking about here. And so there is an opportunity here for us to explore how the UK has approached this in order to see whether there are lessons learned that we could bring back to our municipalities across Canada. Because I think over time, we're going to see a larger number of smaller projects looking to this approach as to whether it's viable or not. And I think that may also prompt a little bit of a recalibration of the traditional approach to P3s in Canada to enable that to happen. Thank you.
Very brief supplementary, if you...
Maybe, I don't know if I'll have another round or not, but I hope I do. And one thing maybe I can just ask you to think about is we've heard a lot about the success side, but I'm wondering about the failure side, because that's also what we'd have to warn governments about. And I'm just wondering if in the next round, perhaps we could look at a point where a contract's failed and the government's had to take over the entire contract, or either on an operational or a capital project. So maybe I'll just let you think about that and we can come back.
I'm afraid, Mr. Russell, we don't have time in this round. I've got to tighten it up a little bit or we won't get opportunities for everyone. So we're going to move right away to Mr. Bernard Trottier with the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses or guests, for being here today. Mr. Romoff, you mentioned that Canada is now considered best in class when it comes to delivering P3 projects and in terms of its P3 model, even though the UK and Australia were early trailblazers. Can you just expand for the committee, what are the elements of the Canadian model that make it best in class?
There are several features that are really differentiators in the Canadian context. First and foremost, our procurement agencies across Canada, the creation of those agencies is in fact a unique feature. So there are no other countries that have subnational procurement agencies engaged in this space. So that brings an approach and a professionalism that is quite unique. But more importantly, these agencies have really streamlined the process for P3 procurements, to the extent that you get a far better disciplined and tight time frame, and that's resulted in reducing the time from a project going out to RFQ or RFP to financial close significantly, such that in some cases, and in fact in the Canadian case, it's virtually half the timeline of the UK, which is in fact in great part why the UK is now looking at our approach to this sector. The other thing I would say is that we are very open in Canada to international engagement in our infrastructure development, and we put high value on the competitive process. And so that levels the playing field for all, and the outcome of that has been that you get much more competition in every project that goes out to bid, and that tends to drive more innovative solutions and certainly drives down the cost. So it's a differentiator.
So those are good practices on the procurement end. What about on the delivery end? And the companies engaged in delivering on P3 projects, are they also then best in class?
That's probably a question that I would turn to Michael.
And the kind of supplemental part of that question is that some unique expertise that we're developing within Canada that can be exploited in terms of being able to sell that expertise internationally.
Well, let me just make one comment on the procurement models that are used. So in Ontario, it's Infrastructure Ontario. In British Columbia, it's Partnerships BC. Those particular approaches to infrastructure development are highly sought after internationally. So there are a number of countries around the world that are looking to move ahead with the P3 approach to infrastructure development, but they don't have either the capacity to do it or a good enough appreciation of how you put in place a framework to enable it to happen. So what we're seeing is that there is a considerable degree of interest, including from the U.S. and from states in the U.S., in what the approach is by Infrastructure Ontario or by Partnerships BC, with a view to taking that approach, adapting it to their particular environment, and moving ahead with P3s. And that too reflects the view internationally that Canada has got it right, and that it's a process that's adaptable in other environments.
I think, just to answer your question, with respect to the Canadian competencies that have been developed, because of the fierce competition from international players, the Canadian companies that have formed have had to become much more competitive to survive. And in fact, I would argue they're thriving because we've got great examples of Canadian companies now competing abroad on PPP projects. PCL, Canada's largest constructor, just won a major project in Australia for $1 billion plus cancer center. Ellis-Don has operations in the Middle East. Aecon doing airports around the world. Now these are all Canadian construction companies have developed tremendous success record overseas as a result of the $58+ billion of projects that have been done here. So it creates more Canadian jobs, it exports Canadian expertise, and is good for the economy here as well as for those entities.
Good, thank you very much. Maybe I just want to change the subject a little bit. So you know, in the province of Quebec, the issue of corruption in the construction industry is front and center, and you know, indeed, that's a concern throughout the country. And none of you really talked about it in your comments, but just in terms of the traditional versus a P3 model, in terms of their vulnerability to corruption, is there something about a P3 model that might mitigate those kinds of? Are there checkpoints within the model within a P3 environment that might mitigate those kinds of points? And maybe I'll ask the other guests to weigh in, starting with Mr. Gill, perhaps.
Well, I think one good point I think has kind of been made is that in either case, you're going out and doing some sort of procurement for these large construction projects. So you're still sending out something to be bid. You're still getting, in many cases, the same types of companies. I mean, Mike gave some good examples of that. So I think at the very least, if there's a risk, the risk is still present in any type of procurement process. And I think the mitigation, the potential mitigation that I think that P3s may have is the enforcement of the contracts in terms of holding. Now, this maybe relates to the private finance issue. If it is financed privately and someone else is on the hook in case something goes wrong, it's very easy, or it's much easier for the government to say, well, we're just not paying you now. Sure, we're going to have to take over the project as it is now if we're committed to delivering the project, but we're not going to pay you, so you're not going to be able to pay back whoever gave you money in the first place. And that is something that is unique to something that is privately financed. So maybe I'll let...
Okay, maybe briefly, I know there's not a lot of time, but just to comment on that.
Thank you, and I agree with Mr. Gill's comments. I've never seen corruption in a P3 contract, which is not to say that it doesn't exist or will never exist. The risks are always there in the process. But one of the things that you can ensure or look to ensure is clarity of terms in the contract and sunshine. And sunshine's a good disinfectant, and this is something of a controversial issue when it comes to contracting. I've seen a bad P3 contract, And I'll point out a couple of things. I'll have to leave it nameless, parties nameless. But the contract allowed the private partner to specify the terms of performance, the metrics by which performance would be measured, and to implement the systems that ran the metrics that produced the performance measure and the bonuses associated with the contract. That was a really, really bad idea. And there's something else about it too, is that I sat in a room with a couple of project proponents and read through the contract. I wasn't allowed to leave the room with the contract. I wasn't allowed to take photocopies of any pages. I had a piece of paper and a pencil that I could make notes on, and that was absolutely it. The contract was not in the public domain. If the parties early on knew that the contract was going to be in the public domain sometime after it was let, after you've been through the bidding process, probably there would have been more discussion about the terms of the contract early on, and Sunlight would have prevented at least that kind of problem. So I won't call that corruption, but certainly it was a bad contract.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poshman. Hugh, you were waiting.
I just want to endorse enthusiastically the comment about sunshine. One of the real challenges for people who are outside the circle, as I am, in doing critical analyses of these things is the paucity of information that's available to actually evaluate these contracts. Several years ago, for example, I did an analysis after the fact, after the contract had been let, of a contract P3 contract to build the hospital in North Bay, Ontario, and literally every iota of that contract that had anything to do with money was redacted. So it was impossible to tell what the circumstance, it was impossible to tell what the terms of the contract were. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages made available on Infrastructure Ontario's website, but not one number. It was as if somebody did a search and replace with a black line for anything that wasn't anything that was a decimal. So transparency issues, I think, are really critical.
Thank you. Mr. Marasco asked for a final comment, and then we're out of time, Bernard. We're well over time, in fact.
So I have a real practical example. I would argue that there is a greater protection under a PPP procurement. And the reason why is there's so much at risk for proponents. There was a federal contract that we recently won for the Communications Security Establishment Canada project. You know, it's a $1 billion plus project, and we had probably $4 or $5 million of bid costs at risk. If you think I'm going to risk $4 or $5 million of our own money by going and lobbying someone that I shouldn't be lobbying, it's a huge deterrent. And I would argue Canada stands above many countries in the world because we've looked at other entities, other countries around the world. It is as clean as it gets because you're just not prepared to risk that kind of money for the lobbying effort. With respect to the sunshine and the transparency, there's an unknown little bit of information that I'll point my research colleagues to, but all of these deals are publicly rated because they're typically financed with bonds, and all of the financials, for the detailed financials for the projects, are available through S&P Ratings Direct or whoever did the ratings report, so it's all publicly available if you dig deep enough.
Interesting. Okay, thank you, Bernard. That's well over time. And now, finally, the Liberals, John McCallum. John, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'm a little bit concerned that what I might call the 4 pro-PP people didn't answer very directly the points made by the one less pro person, Mr. McKenzie, in particular when he said that there's a 1 percentage point difference in interest rate can have a very large effect. And then I noticed in the Globe and Mail article yesterday by Barry McKenna, he cited academic research regarding 28 Ontario PPP projects, which the research says cost 16% more than conventional. And I notice in this document by John Loxley, he refers to a Moncton water treatment P3 plant, which has a lease equivalent to 10% interest rate when the city could have paid less than 6%. So there seems to be, in various places, significant evidence that P3s often cost more. So how would you respond to that?
a list here. Who's first?
I will quickly defer to others, but what I would say, again, with respect to the U of T research, I mean, we know the researcher well. And again, it comes back to Mike's point that that analysis around cost is done at the front end construction cost, as opposed to whole-of-life costs. And if you look at Matty's work and his own recommendations, in fact, what he's saying is, done properly, and where value for money is demonstrated, P3s is the way to go. So the reality is that it depends on where on the timeline you choose to do your analysis. And I think the focus of our approach has been whole-of-life cost, and look at that relative to...
Well, that would seem fairly evident that the research then is fatally flawed, is what you're saying.
I would say that the research is excellent. The slice of it that was used to prepare that article would lend itself to interpretations of maybe the kind that you and others.
Mr. Rowe, yeah, that was pretty good dance, I guess. Right? We've got lots of interest to comment here. Mr. Poshman, then Mr. McKenzie, and then Mr. Gill, and I think that probably will take up our time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question. I was waiting for it and looking forward to it. The yield at which AAA, say, federal government bonds are sold is typically going to be 1.25%. It would be foolhardy, however, to imagine that that represented the cost of borrowing that one should transport and carry over in comparison to a P3 contract. First of all, the debt incurred, or if the financing is done in-house, bears an opportunity cost. It's money that could have gone somewhere else, could have gone to debt reduction. And here the Parti Québécois, in the course of its most recent election in Quebec, was on to something, when they said that perhaps the government ought not to be investing in risky assets on behalf of its residents, but reducing debt, because the risks associated with debt reduction are approximately zero, and you have a known return. You have the interest cost avoided by reducing your debt instead. So on the first instance, there's an opportunity cost associated with government taking on the financing. Second, there is, of course, the deadweight loss associated with the implicit tax burden associated with debt. And you have to do a little calculation after the fact to account for the fact that taxes cost money, they impose a burden on the economy, and the effective interest rate in sort of net present value terms is much, much higher than the 1% because there's a cost of taxation associated with it. And then, of course, there's the financing risk itself. If the government takes on full financing...
I'm going to have to interrupt you. We want to give the others opportunities. You've made some good points. Mr. McKenzie.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I wasn't going to say anything, actually, but when Finn referred to the taxes as a factor that weighs on one side of this equation, of course, taxes are paying for the ongoing costs of P3s as well. I don't see how that's not just neutral as between the two, and I think I don't think it's. I really don't think it's an issue that it costs government less to borrow money than the private sector. The issue is, are there other benefits that come from, and I'm hoping I'm not putting words in people's mouths, but the issue is, are there other benefits that come from this form of organization and management of infrastructure that offset those higher financing costs? And my position is that if we've got problems with the way we run infrastructure in Canada, we should design systems and redesign our way of accounting for things so that there's an incentive in the public sector to do the right thing, not only on the 15% that we do through P3s, but on the 85% that we don't.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. Very briefly, Mr. Gill and also Mr. Marasco would like a brief comment, but then we got to move on.
I'll just say that part of the reason why this is very confusing is there's two different measurements here. Finn was talking largely about the welfare measurement of the overall efficiency gain, and generally the VFMs speak to the government fiscal balance, government fiscal perspective, how many dollars are coming in and out. And they're two different things, and I won't elaborate on that right now, but maybe that's part of the confusion.
Thank you. Mr. Marasco, briefly.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be brief. So I keep hearing about this enormous cost of private sector financing. And again, I think you got to take it in perspective of looking at that whole of life cost, because the reality of it is that, as I said with that example with the Vancouver Trade and Convention Center, the government borrowed $365 million more than they needed to, right? And that was at a lower interest rate, at a lower cost. Okay. Like I said, I racked my brain against this problem for 26 years in the public sector, working with some of the brightest minds that I've still come across, right? You cannot replicate what occurs on the private sector side of these projects in the public sector. And I agree with Hugh. I think as a taxpayer, there's a need to try and continue to improve those systems. But I tell you, after 30 years, I can't find a way. I can't think of a way that you can actually do it. Thank you.
John, I'm afraid that used up all the time, but it was a very good question and a very interesting debate that it generated. Ron Cannon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for a very interesting discussion on a very important proposal and process as we move forward. As indicated, it's in infancy in many ways. Coming from British Columbia, very familiar with Partnership BC and the Okanagan Lake Floating Bridge. Mr. Marasco, I'm sure you're familiar with that, as well as others that have studied the P3 and the success that has been for the community of Okanagan Valley, which I represent, Kelowna Lake Country, but for all of British Columbia. Just wanted to connect with Mr. Poshman. Finn, you're very passionate about your policy on this specific issue, and maybe you could elaborate just specifically. My legislative assistant working on some research on what we found is that the more detailed the contract or the agreement, the better likelihood for a successful outcome. Is that your analysis?
I think that would generally be the case, yeah. You can't specify everything, but you're always going to do the best you can. Each gap that's left in the contract will be an opportunity for error, oversight, or potentially asymmetric information as between the proponent and the government.
And Mr. McCallum made a good point about the article that was referred to in the Globe and Mail, and one item, and I picked it out right away, is how do you quantify risk? How do you establish risk premiums? And you started to talk about briefly, and you got cut off. Maybe you can share about the fact that the cost overrun allocation is fixed in P3s, specifically, as I said, giving incentive to finish on time and on budget, which are very important for whether it's private or public sector dollars.
Yeah, well, how the private proponent goes about pricing risk will be specific to that proponent and the project. In economic terms, risk is a product of the likelihood of an outcome and the harm or benefit associated with the outcome if it occurs. And this is what the private proponent will assess in pricing the contract or pricing their own costs at which they're willing to undertake the contract. And maybe some of my other practitioners here will have comments on that as well.
I would just say that as a result of the intense competition in the Canadian market now, the risk premiums that we would typically charge for these contracts have dwindled, and it's a function of competition. And to quote the Auditor General in the UK, value for money is a function of efficient risk allocation and competition. If you get those two things right, you're going to optimize your value for money, and I think we're seeing that in Canada right now with a tremendous amount of competition in the market.
Just to follow up, there's a statement that the value of risk allocation is set too high. P3s become vehicles for governments to subsidize inflated profits of powerful and well-connected contractors and financial institutions. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that particular statement.
I wish we were one of those. That doesn't exist. The reality of it is that the way we make a profit, and there was a comment made earlier about private sector profits. Our economy is built around private sector entities making money so that we can pay taxes and fund government. That being said, the only way that we make money is we'll get a reasonable return on equity, and we will earn a development fee if we do a good job of managing those risks. And, as a little Canadian company that started in 2005, We've now built 12 projects, $6 billion in infrastructure in Canada, and not all of those projects are profitable. You're going to have winners and losers, and if we do a great job of managing those risks, we're going to have more winners than losers.
Just following up to Mr. Marasco, coming from British Columbia, I know you had a wealth of experience with the Fraser Valley Health Authority and very successful Abbotsford Hospital project. I was at the groundbreaking on Friday in my constituency of Kelowna, Kelowna Lake Country, and the groundbreaking for the Interior Surgical Heart Center, and it's been a great success, and Plenary is one of the leading partners on that. Maybe you can expand on the success of the Abbotsford Hospital and why the Cancer Center Partnership was awarded the Project Finance Magazine's 2004 PPP Deal of the Year for North America.
Thanks. Yeah, I was on the government side for that transaction, for the Abbotsford Hospital project. It was a groundbreaking project for not only the government, but for the industry. And the reason why it was the Deal of the Year is that that project was the first hospital project that had been done in decades in British Columbia that had not been over budget and that came in on time. And so for the government of the day, it really solidified the model and the need for them to continue to implement that model. By comparison, the Jimmy Pattison Pavilion at VGH, the government built that project and it sat empty for 10 years because they didn't have the money to finish it. And they had to re-roof it before they actually fit it out and started using it for patient care. So I think the fact is that in addition to the value propositions that come from these in terms of risk transfer, the fact that we built $50 billion worth of hospital projects in this country over the last 5 years speaks to the ability to get these things built and done. Abbotsford, we spent 20 years in the planning process with failed startups, and the thing never got done. And we just can't afford not to have the infrastructure we need to serve Canadians.
Congratulations. And I'd just like to, there was some a comment about the Ontario government and P3s, but I understand there's an opportunity for a new leader in the provincial government there, so one of these panelists might be interested.
Are you planning on immigrating?
I'll leave that to you, thanks.
Well, I'm sure they would benefit from your experience, Ron. That concludes our first round of questioning. The difficult thing about being in the chair is I don't get to participate in these rounds of questioning, but some people view that as a good thing. I don't know. I have one question on a general policy level, though, if you don't mind my taking it. It seems to me, I disagree, Mr. Marasco, about hospitals. The general conditions and specifications for hospitals are pretty standard. I mean, they're almost cookie-cutter buildings in a sense, whereas the convention center in Vancouver was 7 acres of sod roof cantilevered out over the ocean. Wouldn't we be better off considering P3s for the difficult high-risk buildings and do the cookie cutters ourselves? I mean, it seems that Gary Dewar always used to say there's a tendency to privatize the profits and socialize the losses. It seems to me we're, handing out all the low-hanging fruit, all the easy stuff, and keeping the difficult, expensive stuff in our own public domain.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So having built a convention center ourselves on the waterfront in Melbourne and several hospitals, I would argue any day that a hospital is much more complex and a much more critical environment than a convention center. That's point number one. Hospitals are anything but cookie cutter. In the case of the example, the Interior Heart and Surgical Center that Mr. Cannon referred to, that is built on a very unstable foundation. It's a very complex building on a very complex site. It's way more difficult than any convention center that we built. But you know what? I think to your point, and it speaks to the earlier questions about what works for PPPs, the reality is there's a stronger value proposition the more complex the project is. There's no doubt about it.
Good. Well, thank you very much. That's helpful. Okay, we're going to start our next round of questioning. We have only 10 minutes left, so perhaps we could keep it to strictly 5 minutes each, and that would give us time for one New Democrat and one Conservative, and then we cut it off at exactly 10:30 because we do have some business in camera that we need to do. So for the NDP, Jean-François Larose.
Merci à nos invités d'être ici.
Thank you to our witnesses for coming. Thank you for the answers you've provided. Personally, I have more questions than answers. But in the arguments put forward, what's always compared is traditional contracts. We're not talking today about the public sector. There were shortcomings that were mentioned concerning the government, and P3 seemed to be the solution. However, what I have a hard time with is that we're not talking about correcting government flaws. My question is for Mr. Mackenzie. Thank you for coming today. A major argument for promoting P3s, well, it seems that the risks are shared with the private sector. But in fact, when P3s run into major problems, it's the public that suffers the consequences. For example, if there's a bankruptcy, it's the public that's going to pay. Could you talk about what you call walkaway risks? Could you provide a few concrete examples where the costs to taxpayers in the public sector were much higher than expected? That's my first question.
With respect to the last part of your question, there's a good inventory of a fairly large number of projects, and I'll put in parenthesis that I'm sure that my colleagues will say that many of those projects are from the bad old days when things weren't done as well as they are today. But if you look at if committee staff or you or your staff look at the Boardman and Viner paper, that has a fairly careful review of a fairly large number of projects. On the question of risk, risk allocation is sorry, I'm yelling at myself in the ear here. Risk allocation and risk transfer is an issue that is really in contention amongst people who study this. I will acknowledge that. The accountant study that I referred to in Britain looked at an extensive list of P3 projects, largely in roads and hospitals, and came to the conclusion that when you actually drilled into the details of those contracts and looked at how they actually operated, there was very little risk that was transferred, and there were new risks that were created that were related to the survival of the entity, the viability of the entity that had the responsibility for operating the project. And I would further say that the issue of what value gets placed on the risks that's transferred, at least in Ontario, as you look at the way that the way that Infrastructure Ontario justifies value for explains value for money. The overwhelming majority of the benefits associated with P3 projects in the Infrastructure Ontario model have to do with very large values that are assigned to risk transfer. And interestingly enough, they don't. Their analysis does not highlight what I would have thought, given the comments that we've heard today, would be more important things, which are improvements in life cycle maintenance cost, expected better performance at the end of the contract, and so on.
Else who would like to comment on Jean-Francois's point? If not, you have about a minute and a half, Jean-Francois, for a second question.
Okay.
I know you also feel, well, could you explain how, in general, regarding the argument for P3s, the issue that arises is that we always seem to take the position that P3s will be the magic bullet. But it's only since the 1980s that in Canada we've been developing this, and as you've mentioned, there have been many problems that have come up. So if we take the position that it's a magic bullet, while you're saying that we have to be careful, it doesn't apply everywhere, and I think that's very good. And we need to adapt this. The problem I have is, what are we going to end up with at the end of the day, at the end of the contract? Because at the end of the day, no matter what we say, the risk is on taxpayers. We're the ones who will be paying for the mistakes that are made. So a more careful approach would be appreciated because it's our money that's being managed. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Like governments and proponents both go through a learning process. Some time ago, I wrote a chapter with Boardman and Vining where we looked at North American P3s, some successes and failures. And an example was a toll highway that I believe was in North Carolina. It was written with a contract under the expectations that toll volumes would be much higher than they were, in fact. The private proponent got in a bind with respect to bond financing. Tolls went up, traffic went down, and they got into a worse bind and had to walk away. And the government was left with a very expensive highway that nobody really wanted to use much, and this was a failure. It was bad. It was a bad contract design. The governments and the proponents got it wrong in how they managed the bond issues and the financing terms around them. And you learn. And as I say, look, doctor, it hurts when I do that. Don't do that. You learn and get better.
Thank you, Finn. Mr. Marasco, very briefly, please.
Yeah, just in the general terms with respect to contract failures, I could give you some really good case study examples where when these projects fail, it's our equity at risk, it's the bond financing that's at risk, and if that goes sideways, taxpayers are generally picking up an asset for cents on the dollar. Good example in Australia, La Trobe Hospital, where they did transfer revenue risk to the private partner. Private partner couldn't make it work, and after 3 years, it went into receivership and bankruptcy. The government picked up a brand new hospital that they said they needed, otherwise they wouldn't have procured it, for 85 cents on the dollar. That's not a bad deal for taxpayers. Yes, it was stressful for everybody, but generally that's what happens in these transactions.
Thanks, Mr. Marasco. And finally, we'll have Peter Braid for 5 minutes. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel of experts for being here this morning. Mr. Poshman, a question to start with you. I'm curious about this. Wanted to ask about your perspective on the notion of private sector job creation. Are there any differences in your estimation in the level of private sector job creation when comparing traditional government procurement infrastructure projects with P3s?
Well, it's a good question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Braid. I'm not sure I have a clear view on that. Certainly, there's going to, if you do an in-house procurement and all of the facets that go along with that. For instance, some highways departments have their own repair maintenance facilities. Some municipalities are even considering acquiring equipment to do their own construction. There's going to be a lot of in-house jobs associated with those. Is that a good idea? It doesn't strike me as likely, because this is an area where the private sector demonstrates that it's very, very good at doing something, and the public sector agency, contracting agency, doesn't have to take on the risks of acquiring equipment, doesn't have to build the processes that goes with it, doesn't have to build the payroll and the constituency that goes with it when you do this in-house. So whether there are more or fewer jobs, or I'm relatively unconcerned. The idea is that the jobs should be done by the party best able to do them and best able to manage the risks.
Okay, Mr. Marasco.
I would argue actually that in fact it ends up in the long run because of the knock-on effect of generating more jobs. And the case in point is when we develop this expertise in the private sector in Canada and are able to export that expertise abroad. It has a multiplier effect, and so the expertise, for example, that PCL has developed in Canada around PPPs now, they're exporting that to Australia. Likewise with other construction companies that they wouldn't have otherwise done if these jobs had been performed in the public sector.
Thank you. Mr. Romoff, you mentioned that the marketplace for P3s is growing. What's causing that? What's underneath that?
I think at the heart of it is a large infrastructure deficit in Canada. So that's prompting a real serious look at how to address that issue, and again in a time of fiscal challenge. So that requires a real good look at what are the approaches that are possible, which are the most innovative ones, and so that's prompted a lot more interest in the case of P3s. And I think you're seeing this growth in the market reflected in, as I mentioned earlier, provinces that haven't historically been active in this space. Saskatchewan is the case in point, and a growing interest on the part of municipalities that are looking at this approach.
Great, thank you. Mr. Gill, in your opening remarks, I think you made reference to the fact that often with P3 projects, there are bundling of the components of a P3 project. Why are the components of a P3 project typically bundled, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Actually, I'd say that they're not necessarily typically bundled, and this is the whole gray area of what a P3 is or is not. So many of the hospitals that we're talking about in Ontario, for example, they don't even have an ongoing operating or maintenance phase. It's simply the construction period. The reason why we want to bundle the two is that if you're responsible for maintaining an asset for 30 years, you're probably going to take a little bit more care up front to make sure it lasts and you minimize your costs over the life cycle. So the more that you do that, you're probably going to have to pay more up front for it, but the benefits should be stronger. So I think we should be clear about what is and what is not bundled within the P3 space.
Thank you. My BlackBerry says it's 10:30.
Thank you very much, Peter, for helping with that. We've been very good, a very interesting debate. All the witnesses, thank you very much for very points well made and well argued. This opens the first meeting of many as we study this issue, and we thank you very much for your time and your presentations today. We're going to suspend or adjourn? Suspend. We're going to suspend the meeting briefly and allow the witnesses to leave and then reconvene in camera. Meeting is suspended.